Hi, my name is Peter McAllister, and I'm talking to Ron Pisaturo, the author of a book entitled A Validation of Knowledge. It's an epistemology book. Ron, it's nice to see you today.
Great to see you, Pete.
Thanks. Um, uh, I had a conversation that one of the things that came up in your book is it touched on a conversation I had several years ago with a professor of philosophy. He was a pragmatist, and he maintained that as far as science and religion are concerned, that just as a theologian, ultimately the epistemological base of the theologian's beliefs stem from faith. He said so too. Ultimately, science rests upon an act of faith, whereas the theologian believes then that God is the creator of the universe, and everything comes from God, and there's various religious beliefs can explain the universe and everything in it. The scientist similarly believes the same about experimentation, about observation, that sort of thing. Now you have a different view on that, and also I noticed that there was a conversation between James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson, and I was a bit surprised to find that they believe that essentially something very similar, that the scientific project, the basis of the whole scientific project lies in the Judeo-Christian heritage. And I noticed in your book, you offer a different viewpoint on that. So I was wondering, Ron, if you wouldn't mind, could you just elaborate on your position?
Yeah, sure. So in my book, I present a positive theory, right? My book is very light on polemics. It just covers this is how we validate our corpus of knowledge. And I start with axioms and I build from there. But I can say some polemical things today in response to this objection that your professor raised and all. So first preliminary to state, I think, is that we should not be comparing religion to science. Those two are not really commensurable. It's really religion, or religion as a philosophy, versus a secular philosophy, right? Because a secular philosophy deals with issues like where do we start in our epistemology, and what are our axioms, and where's our means of knowing. And that provides a basis for the scientists. So that's what I'll be comparing. I'll be comparing a religious philosophy versus a secular philosophy. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so let's start with a religious one. Now you see that they say, okay, I can start with my belief. I have this belief in God, right? But they're introducing under the covers, under the hood, an additional assumption, right? Because they're also assuming that this God entity exists in the same world, in the world, and more to the point, that this God entity has an effect on the world that we see, the world that the religionists recognize, that the scientists see and want to call into question. As the scientists or the secular philosophers recognize the existence of some world external to our consciousness, so does the religionist. He's just not making that point. Because what he's doing is he's saying not only is there this God entity, but this God entity has an impact on the life that we're experiencing here in the secular world. So he's making that additional, very important assumption. Because you can say, well, what does a belief in God establish? Well, it establishes I can believe things. And then I can believe more things. I can also believe in Santa Claus, and I can believe in a whole mythology that I will construct from these gods. But at the end of the day, what they're driving at is this whole belief system that they're starting with axiomatically, as they say, has an impact on this other world that they're saying, well, that's not really the important world, but they're saying it is important because they're saying God has an impact on it. And the way that we can know how to deal with the world of objects in front of us and the events in our lives is by knowing God. So they're assuming this further crossover from one realm to the other. Okay, so that's already an asymmetry, right, between these two systems of belief. The second,
Ron,
yeah,
Ron, if I may, the belief is that this world is almost, if you will, kind of like a metaphysical afterthought, right?
yeah, yeah.
That
But go ahead. Sorry.
no, that's all. That it's not that that God has an impact on this world. It's this world is is created by God, exists because God, for whatever reason, created it, got around to making it, and it's almost foolish to focus on the material world. The far more important consideration is the other world, is the realm of God, if you will. Okay, so I think the idea of God having an impact on this world is this world is God. And I mean, I don't want to sound like Spinoza, but this world in effect is just it's just almost like a footnote to God. Anyway, I'm sorry, I just wanted to throw that.
I understand that, and they say it's a footnote. Nevertheless,
Yeah,
they prescribe a course of action, right, in this footnote.
right.
The consistent religionist, if he took what you just described to its full extent, would say, okay, end my life or pay zero attention to this life and just go into this other world that God, is involved in. So you see how they smuggle in this thing. Oh yeah, it's a footnote. Nevertheless, we're now going to prescribe to you, jot and tittle of everything you should do in this world of experience, right?
And one of those things, interestingly, one of those things is to say, wait a minute, your life is not yours. Your life is God's property. And
right.
should you decide to accelerate the process and unite with God, shall we say, prematurely by committing suicide, that's a violation of God's property rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they are, in effect, smuggling in this idea, this assumption that they say is, oh, the scientists only do that, but we have our beliefs. They're smuggling in, but the beliefs cross over into one. Whereas the secular people don't claim any crossover into another realm, right? They don't say our assumptions apply to God's realm because we say there is no such realm, right?
Well, there's sort of a chicken and egg kind of thing going on here.
A chicken and egg.
What comes first, God or the universe? The religionists would say, the theologians would say, well, God, and then the universe comes. But your approach, if I understand it, is no, you start with the universe.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so if you would, please.
Yeah, I start with the universe and I stay with the universe. So what I'm driving at is the religionists don't deny the existence of this world of experience. And now we'll go to the secular side. I'm not assuming that there's a world here. The world makes me aware of it, whether I assume it or not. And whether I want it to be there or not, it impinges on me, right?
Right.
If I close my eyes and I'm only have my sensor, my sense of touch or whatever, if something hits me, I feel it, whether I want to feel it or not.
Right.
Pain that I might feel impinges on me, whether I want it or not. I'm not making an assumption of those things. Those things present themselves to me, right? So it's not you see, many times, because the religionists start with this set of assumptions, they think that, oh, everybody else does, but we don't. We start with our experience.
Right.
and then we address our experience. So and there are many philosophers who make it easy for the religionists to assert that, because many philosophers say, oh, we start with these a priori ideas. For instance, a whole history of rationalists have that idea. And even more contemporary philosophers than, let's say, going back to Descartes, there are philosophers who said, for instance, that the laws of logic are a priori, meaning that we know or we assume them before we even deal with any reality. Now, that's not what I do in my book. I establish that every method that we have comes from our experience. So I started with, well, their experience of the external world itself is something that makes itself apparent to us. So that's not an assumption. Now, the second part of it is that the religionists, some of the, like that professor, will say, well, but reason is an assumption.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, the secularist comes at the world with an assumption that reason applies, and that is also not true. The way I develop reason in the book is that you don't start with this idea of having reason. You have these experiences of the world, and you observe from experience that you have certain abilities and to rearrange, order, address these experiences, and all those methods together. At the end, you can say, oh, I have this method of reason that's a way of processing all these experiences. So, for instance, one of the first things that a philosopher can observe that he can do is, okay, I have this experience of this man in front of me, and these other objects which move separate from their background. I can pick out parts of the whole vista of my field of vision, and so I can break things into parts. He doesn't assume that he can do that. He observes that he can do that. So that's one process of reasoning right away, is an ability to do an analysis, to differentiate some parts from other parts. And then he also can observe, well, I notice this object moving across, that there's some kind of persistence in the object. As it moves. He doesn't say, I'm going to assume that happens. He observes it. And so what he's doing there is a kind of integration of his visual field over a period of time, and he sees something that is persisting, right? And then he also can notice, oh, I'm looking at this, and this reminds me of this other object that looks similar. I don't happen to have another cup here, but I can do it with books. Not to promote my books or anything. Oh, this thing looks and feels somewhat similar to this other thing in comparison to, say, an object like that, right? And so he notices that he's able to take his experiences, break them into pieces, but also put them together into groups, right? So he's able to rearrange the material of his experiences in various ways, to differentiate parts from a whole, to take parts and put them into a group, which eventually becomes a process of conceptualization. And there are some more things that he comes to realize that he can do in processing all of this sensory experience. And he doesn't assume that he can do any of them. He comes to observe that oh my gosh, I was able to do that.
He does it.
He does it. That's right.
There's no assumption. You're not assuming that coffee cup. You're not assuming those keys or those books.
That's right. That's right. And that's generally the way people develop any kind of skill or ability. They do it first, and they say, oh, what is that thing I just did? the philosopher comes later, and because people reasoned for a long time before they knew what reason was, right?
Right. But Ron, if I may, that is your starting point. Okay.
Yeah.
In effect, your starting point is not even existence. It's awareness of existence. As you say, things impinge upon you, right?
Yeah.
So you start with that, and then in effect, you're saying that things are consistent. For example, that you over time you'll notice that everything that exists, everything impinges on you is something, right? There's nothing exists that just is sort of something in general. All right, so your starting point then is experience is valid, and from your experience you can then come to rock solid assumptions as far as reason, that sort of thing. Is that a fair assessment?
And there wouldn't be assumptions at that point. There are apprehensions, right? You come to understand that you have, and to give some other examples that flow out of the discussion you just introduced, is that yes, we have this awareness of something out there, and from that we can distinguish two other elements in our whole experience. There's something that we're aware of, and there's I who is aware of it. So we have existence and consciousness, right? So by a process of analysis of our experience, we can say, oh, there are two different parts of it. And then from that, then from further analysis, we can realize, well, there's a certain kind of relation between the two. Because this thing out here makes me aware of it, right? I feel something hit me, and then I realize, well, that is a causal relation, and that is in my judgment, that's not chronologically our first awareness of causality, but philosophically, it's the most basic one that we can start with to validate that it's inescapable that there is a causal relation between the world and our consciousness. The world makes us aware of it.
So in effect, Ron, you're the polar opposite of Rene Descartes. Where instead of I think, therefore I am, you're saying existence, therefore me, or existence, therefore, and I'm conscious of it. That, in other words, existence comes first.
That's right.
Awareness is,
that's right.
Epistemologically.
Now, I'm not the first one to state that. I learned it from Ayn Rand, right? That's her primacy of existence, and she starts with the axiom of existence and makes a very big deal of that we have to start with existence, and then consciousness comes from that.
That's also implicit in Aristotle, but yes, go ahead.
That's why I said that's where I learned it. I'm not saying that even she was the first to say that, but I think a contribution I make is the apprehension that from that get-go we can also establish a rudimentary form of causality, because this relation of consciousness being aware of existence, or existence making consciousness aware of it, is a causal relation. So from the very start, that establishes, oh, there is causality. And again, we were able to do that because we have this ability to analyze, to break into parts, and then put back together in various ways, the elements of what we are aware of. Okay. So in this way, I'm arguing that we don't make any assumptions. We start with what we're aware of directly, and we make inferences from that. But they're not what these other people would accuse of being a priority before experience. They come after experience, the conceptualization of these ideas.
For example, the religious ideas.
Well, yeah. Well, what I'm saying is these ideas of existence and consciousness, causality, come after our experience of the world. We see the world, and then we were able to discern these parts, and then we're able to make integral. And by discerning the parts, we can then also discern relations between the parts, and that's where we get existence and consciousness and causality and identity, right? Because existence is different from the consciousness, so each one has its identity. And of course, we observe different objects in the world. The very fact that we observe objects comes from experience, and then we can differentiate them, and so each one is what it is, which is different from what this thing is, right? And so that's where we get a difference in identity.
Now that yes, I think you've made that pretty clear, and that in effect that sort of disagrees with the theological view. I mean, you don't the first idea you have is not of a deity. It just, you don't wake up and go, oh God, or I may say that in the morning, but oh God. But anyway, all right. So now I think you're sort of contrasting that. Well, I think you're contrasting that with, all right, the theological argument, all the arguments based on faith ultimately come down to is, well, do you believe me or do you believe your lying eyes? Right? It sort of comes down to that. And then I thought it was very interesting, though, that Lindsay and Peterson took a very different approach to that, and I was sort of surprised. They would have been a consistent defenders of reason and existence. Anyway, I mean, would you want to play that, Ron?
I'm going to show that. The only thing is, I wonder if we should also talk about how I contrast with the Cartesian idea of the prior certainty of consciousness, and that consciousness is really all that we can be certain of, and we don't really know that it's a reality.
I think
as you raised. And I address that directly in my book. I'll try to give an impromptu discussion of that, but to answer that challenge, well, consciousness is consciousness. So when I look out there and I see something else, is that my consciousness? Well, if it's not a state of my consciousness, then it's not my consciousness. So it's not my consciousness. And you could say, well, is it created by my consciousness?
Right.
Well, am I conscious of creating it?
Well, when you say what do you mean when you say state of consciousness?
Well, there are some people who say, well, how do we know that the world out there was just not created by our own consciousness?
Right.
And what I'm saying is, well, we know what our consciousness is. It's being conscious, right?
Right.
Is this thing out there part of my consciousness? No, my consciousness is I'm consciousness of it.
Right.
I don't also have another state of consciousness of being that thing. So that's just not consciousness, just not what consciousness is.
Right.
And did I create this thing through my consciousness? Well, that would mean that I was conscious of creating it.
Right.
And are you conscious of creating this?
You might have forgotten.
You might have forgotten, but right now, so even if that were true, right now it's there. It's what it is.
So you're saying, so you define consciousness as awareness.
Well, consciousness is an axiomatic concept, so I can give synonyms of it just to try to get your mind to focus on what it is. But the only way to know what consciousness is, you have to introspect and say, oh yeah, that's what Ron was trying to point me to. But the only way to grasp it is you have to, introspect and focus on that state of awareness and say, oh yeah, that's what consciousness is. And then you look at it in an object and you say, well, that's not what that is in my head. That's something else apart from me. And now another way to think of that is consciousness is always consciousness of something, right?
Yes.
So you can be conscious of your consciousness through introspection, but then it has to be conscious of your consciousness of something.
Something, right.
Consciousness of consciousness of consciousness of, there's always got to be a thing at the end that's not your consciousness. And if you kept going, if you keep trying to put consciousness at the end of that phrase, there's got to be an of. There's always got to be an of after the consciousness.
Right.
So it would be an infinite regress, right? That's another way to think of it. If you thought that all that existed was consciousness,
yes,
it's always got to be consciousness of something. So that's my refutation of this argument that well, maybe there's only consciousness. Okay.
Right. Well, also the thing is, if an aspect of consciousness, or maybe the essential characteristic of consciousness is awareness, then an awareness of nothing that exists other than itself is is kind of a contradiction in terms.
That's right. That's right. You can't, because it has to be awareness of something.
Yeah,
right.
Something.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's always got to be, anytime you have awareness or consciousness,
right,
there's an implicit of after it and a content.
Content. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
So that's my discussion. Yeah. So let's play Jordan Peterson interviewing James Lindsay, and because they'll confirm, it'll make us realize, oh my gosh, people today really think this, and he'll also raise, both of them actually will raise other things that then you and I can address further.
Okay.
Right. Well, this is one of the things that's so interesting, I think, is that, and I don't know what you make of this exactly, but one of the things I see happening is that, so the Enlightenment critique was one of the reasons for the death of God. Okay? Now, and the new atheist types, Dawkins and Harris, Dawkins in particular, would celebrate the death of God because that would free the scientific enterprise from the superstitious overlay that was interfering with clear rationality. Is a question, which is, well, what is the relationship, let's say, between the Judeo-Christian tradition and science? And one answer is antagonistic, right? And the other is, no, the Judeo-Christian tradition established the monasteries. For example, the universities grew out of the monasteries, and the scientific tradition grew out of the universities, and that there's actually, that the scientific project is actually embedded in the Judeo-Christian project, and the reason for that is the Judeo-Christian project is predicated on the Greek idea that there's a logos in the world, and the Jerusalem idea that there's a logos in the intellect, and all of that's a precondition for science, and if we lose God, we'll lose science too. And I think that's what's happening. Yeah, I think that the new atheists, because I think the historical notion that there is an antagonism between science and religion is actually a misreading of history. I don't think that is how it laid itself out. And I do believe that it's an oddly postmodern argument in some ways, is that the scientific enterprise is embedded in the broader Judeo-Christian narrative. So when I look at someone like Dawkins, for example, I think, okay, here's what you believe, Dr. Dawkins. Yeah. You believe there's logos in the world. Yes. Because otherwise there's an intelligible order in the world. You believe that studying that intelligible order is redemptive, right? No, first you believe that you are constituted so that you could understand that order. Yes. And then you believe that if you understood that order, that would be redemptive. It's like every single one of those axioms is religious.
That's right. That is the fundamental construction, in fact, of a religion. It's, in fact, if we boil it down into legalese, what the Supreme Court recognizes as what constitutes an established religion for Establishment Clause purposes. Is it a comprehensive system of belief and practice that this is their definition, that answers fundamental questions about the world and man's role in it such that it gives rise to duties of conscience? And this is precisely, you know, the legalese kind of practical version of those same fundamental axioms. Because these things, there is that multi-dimensional convergence of what's really going on. Yeah, well, it
might be, you know, that the most fundamental axioms of a conceptual system are religious claims by definition. You have to say, we hold these things to be self-evident. And I would say, well, Dawkins has to hold the three things that I laid out as self-evident. And I think that those are part and parcel of the original Judeo-Christian argument.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, the fact that the entire scientific enterprise, as hardcore as physics might be, utterly depends on a complete and irrational faith that there is a logical structure to the world that doesn't change, or that only changes in ways that are intelligible.
Right, because well, you could also easily set up as an axiom that it is immoral to analyze the transformations of the material world because all that will produce is danger. And you know, the Frankenstein story, the Golem story, the Tower of Babel story, for that matter, are variations of that axioms. Right, look out, be careful what you study. You know, you might open Pandora's box, for example, or have your liver torn out forever because you're Prometheus. And, you know, there's certainly, you can make a case for that. So the axiom that investigating the transformations of the material world in good spirit, let's say in the proper spirit, will be redemptive, that isn't a factual statement, right? It's an a priori claim.
Yeah, that's an axiom. It's like the axiom of infinity. Is there infinity? Who knows? But mathematicians generally accept that, okay, we're going to use this concept of infinity. We're going to say there's infinity, but technically,
and then we're going to see what happens.
It is unknowable if there is infinity.
Right.
By definition, it's unknowable. But there's an axiom called the axiom of infinity. Infinity exists. It more or less is what it states. There's a
well, I've started to understand that, like that the most fundamentally religious and the most fundamentally axiomatic, that's the same thing.
Sure.
Okay, and that makes sense to you?
That makes complete sense to me, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so now you go down the axiom hierarchy, and the farther down you go, the closer you get to the sacred, essentially. And I think the reason that it's sacred, by the way, so axioms constrain entropy. That's a good way of thinking about it, right? And so the reason that you have to hold some things as sacred is because the things you hold as sacred are the things that constrain the most entropy in your conceptual system. So if you blow an axiom, you free the entropy. That's what happened to you when you read that paper.
Yes.
That's why you're hiding in that room for 3 days.
3 days.
Okay, Pete, I think that's the gist of what I wanted to cover with you.
There's something I would just want to mention that Professor Peterson, Dr. Peterson said, and that is that the fact that there's logos, order, the fact that there's logos in the universe, and the fact that there's logos that we're capable of grasping that order, that there's logos in our intellect, somehow is indicative of something sacred. Again, something religious. So I was wondering, Ron, could you start there? Could you respond to that?
Well, I would like to start with something a little bit before that, based on what you just introduced, but I'll get to that pretty quickly.
By all means.
I just want to point out before I forget this idea of axioms. So when most people in our culture use the word axiom, they're thinking of an axiom of a deductive system, going back as far as Euclid, right? You have these axioms of geometry, and then you deduce from there. And one thing distinctive about Ayn Rand is that axioms in her system are not what they would call a priori, and they're not something you deduce from. The axioms are facts that you identify in reality that are foundational to everything else, and they can't be denied. But your subsequent knowledge does not just flow deductively from the axioms. You have the axioms and they're essential. Nevertheless, you still need to look at reality and gather further observations to form further conclusions. Whereas these guys, when they say the word axiom, they're assuming, oh, I got the axiom and now I can turn away from reality and just deduce from there. And we have to distinguish our position from that. So the idea,
when you say axiom, you would mean, for example, the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah, and
that something can both mean A and non-A.
Right.
And well, if I could just finish,
Yeah.
the self-evident aspect of that is that even the skeptic, even someone who would seek to deny the law of non-contradiction has to use it in effect. All right, that would be, for example, Aristotle's reaffirmation through denial is you just that, in other words, to state the positive, that any positive statement relies on the law of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. For example, as sort of axiomatic, based on observations, knowledge of existence, or experience, even more fundamental, experience of existence. Is that fair? Is that what you'd say?
Well, I say something deeper than that. What you just described is a way
But you
to,
agree with that?
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure what you mean. So let me.
Okay. All right.
I agree
All right.
that this idea of reaffirmation through denial is a way to show that something is an axiom. But that's
Right.
not the way we know it's true. We know the axiom of non-contradiction, and actually there are things that come before that, right? There's identity, and
Right.
there's existence and consciousness. Those are really the
Right.
three primary axioms in objectivism, and also in pretty much in my system. Although
Any rational philosophy. Yeah.
yeah, I also have causality in there, and I have there's difference as well as identity, but those are technical details. But the way we know, for instance, the law of contradiction is not just from what you say. More fundamentally, we have to look at reality, and we realize that certain characteristics preclude other characteristics. So think of the statement, this is a digression now, but maybe it's important. Think of the statement, a thing cannot be A and non-A at the same time, right? So it cannot be
Right.
blue and red at the same time in the same respect, right? But it can be blue and round at the same time in the same, those are different
Right.
respects, right?
Right.
How do we know what it means to be non-A? How do we know that blue is non-red? How do we know that this long is this long? We have to look at reality and observe and apprehend that certain characteristics preclude other characteristics. And that's
Right.
how we know when something is commensurable. And then we can formalize that statement by saying the law of non-contradiction. But again, it comes from an observation in reality. It is not what these guys would call a priori. Okay.
Right.
So like when I go into an example in my book, if we have a length, let's say, that is 5 inches long, and we have another length that's 7 inches long, we know it cannot be both 5 inches long and 7 inches long at the same time in the same respect. And that's because we hold up the two lengths, like two different sticks, and we line up one side, and we see on the other side, one continues on and the other one doesn't. And no matter what we do to fudge and move the sticks along each other, we cannot get them to line up on both ends. And we realize that they preclude each other. And then we realize that length is a commensurate characteristic in both of them, and one precludes the other. And though examples such as that teach us that we have this very powerful tool called the law of non-contradiction, that there are certain attributes that preclude one another, and that becomes very valuable in our analysis of our experience.
Right.
So that's my further elaboration on what you say.
Okay. Well, let's just quickly then let's dispatch the idea. Let me. I'll use the word trust versus faith. All right.
Mm-hmm.
That in essence, your approach is observe and conclude. Right.
That's
and
a nice short way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, and you trust that, right?
Yeah.
Fair?
So, right. Go ahead. Continue.
Okay. So then how would you respond to the let's say a skeptic pragmatist who would come back and say, well, you know, a scientist trusts the scientific method, and a theologian trusts the theological method, if you will. How would you respond? Can you respond to that? I mean, ultimately, you have to start somewhere. How would you address that?
Yeah. So let's again compare the theologian with the secular philosopher, and use the example that Jordan Peterson used about the world being orderly, that you have to trust, that, or the theologian starts with this belief that again, a priori, that the world is orderly.
Right.
Well, the secular philosopher, let's say rational philosopher, does not start with a trust. He starts with this reality that has an effect on him. And he also wants to know about how reality is going to continue to have an effect on him. He's staying in that realm. And he observes that things act regularly. Now, he observes certain things don't act regularly. The way you get the concept of regular or orderly initially, I think, is that you see certain things seem more regular than others. Like lots of things are buzzing around, but this object retains some kind of ongoing integrity. So with the buzz around, this object is more orderly. That we see entities, which is a kind of orderliness, right? It's the most fundamental kind of orderliness we're aware of, because we see parts of the whole visual field or whole perceptual field. We see such parts that maintain their integrity over time, right? So that's what it means to be orderly. And they act on me in a way that is somehow unchanging or constant in some way over time. And there are other things that we don't necessarily see order in, but that's how we learn. We conclude that it's orderly, and then we trust it because we've observed it, right? And everything we're trying to do has to do with wanting to know how to deal with this world that we observe. Right. We're going to want to take actions in the future that give us outcomes that make us feel good in our sense, give us pleasure and not pain, that make us continue to survive. Most fundamentally. So we're trying to we observe this realm, and we're trying to stay in this realm, and so all of our observations and processing of our observations that I talked about before are inputs to understanding this world that we see. So the trust comes at the end. It's not an a priori, I'm going to go in trusting this and that. We go in with our eyes open, we observe things, we draw conclusions, and then we trust the conclusions that we drew because they were from those observations.
Well, and one further thing is that they prove to be reliable, universally reliable.
Yeah. Now I can address something a little bit more narrow. One of them between Lindsay, I think it was Peterson said, and we also trust that it's going to continue to be orderly. So that's an interesting topic to address, and I'm going to guess that comment is coming from the skepticism that reached a zenith with David Hume, right, the philosopher who challenged that we could know anything about the future from the past, right? And he challenged the very existence of causality because we don't see causality. We see these objects, but causality is this, this amorphous thing that
You don't, well,
might
you
or
don't
might
see.
not exist. What's
Yeah,
that?
Ron, if I may
Yeah.
interject, we don't see the iron link. We don't see the necessity that if if I well, I don't know, if I'm not going to do it, but if I drop this, if I release this mouse, it will necessarily fall. We don't see that. We don't see it, and right. And according to Hume's ideas, if you can't form an image of it, or you don't have direct perception of it, the other thing is it's meaningless. So
That's
yes,
right.
okay. So
And
I
that,
understand what you're saying.
yeah, and that's a philosophical view that's known as sensualism. The only thing you can know is something
Right. Yes.
that you directly sense, and that goes hand in hand with
That would be the
empiricism.
That would be the epistemological position, be sensualism, right?
Yeah,
and I guess I'm sorry. The metaphysical correlate to that would be nominalism, right? The idea that there are that the concepts themselves don't exist, that they're just sort of convenient groupings for the sake of getting through the day.
Well,
that we impose on the world.
Yeah, the reference of the concepts don't go together the way the concept, they don't go together in reality the way the concepts try to put them together. That's just something that we impose on them. Yeah.
Right.
That's
that's Hume's contribution, if you will, to Western thought.
Right.
Yeah.
So, one answer at the get-go is, well, reject sensualism, but the other thing, and this is again where I think I make a new contribution, is in my establishment of causality right from the get-go with the relation of existence to consciousness. That's how we know right from the get-go that there is such a thing as causality.
Yes.
Existence causes me to know it, to be aware of it.
Right.
So, and I can get into a few more things, but then we observe that this causal relation between existence and consciousness has exhibited a regularity, and that we know from the very fact that we perceive entities, right? Because that means there's a part of existence that is impinging on my consciousness in a regular, predictable way, or I should say regular way. That's the very reason that we are aware of entities.
Right.
But then comes the last step, or a couple more steps. Then another step is, well, so we know that conscious existence has a causal effect on my consciousness in a regular way with these entities.
Right.
How, though, do we know that two entities in the external world, apart from my consciousness, have an effect on one another? These two things both affect me. How do I know they affect one another? How do I know, for instance, that if I move my day timer across the screen, that it's going to hold up this white object, right? How do I know that these two things affect each other, right? How do I know if this key taps on this object, it's going to make a sound, right?
Right.
So my argument, and you'd have to look at my book to see this, is that's a probabilistic argument with a tremendous amount of data, data to support it, and it makes the probability astronomically high, or the difference between it and one is minuscule. But what gets that argument, that probabilistic argument, off the ground is the absolute certainty that these things are acting on my consciousness. That's how we know that causality exists. And then I use a combination of an argument I call the n/n+1 argument that dates back in pieces to Harold Jeffreys in 1932, and it goes on from there. At one point, it was called something like a fiducial argument, but it's been generated. Maybe I should not go into the details now until you can ask me later.
It's in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book. But then there's also what I use in some places is a Bayesian argument. Now, the problem with the Bayes arguments in the past have always been, how do you establish the
prior probabilities?
That's right, the prior probability. So the way I establish the prior probability is that we know that these things act on me. So it's a non-trivial prior probability that causality exists, and that's what establishes the
priors.
Yeah. So that's my solution to that. And then there's the question of, well, then how do we know that these causal interactions are going to causal forces are going to continue into the future? Right. And I have a couple of things to say about that. One thing is, and I did not write this in the book, I thought of this recently, I probably should add it. We observe that causal forces and causal interactions occur over time because we see causal chains. Right. And for instance, we can see the discrepancy in causal chains when we see an object in the distance and hear it a little bit later, right? And so we see that there's a little bit of a delay in time for the sound to travel to us, right? So but then we have many other examples of causal chains. And that means that they occur over time, so that what's happening now in the present is going to have a causal impact on what's going to happen in the future, because we have all this evidence of causal chains. Right. And the second thing is a little bit of a polemic jujitsu on Hume, when he states that, well, we don't see causality, right? Well, but we can infer causality the way I just did. But here's an interesting thing. We don't see time. And Hume is always, trotting out this idea, well, the future, we don't know about, we don't see there. And in fact, time is not an entity. Time per se is not a causal factor. It's only through entities. It's only entities that act on us that we are aware of causally. Right. Time is a relation among entities and regarding motion, right? So regarding the motion of entities, things happen during time. There is no.
Well, Brian, if I could just elaborate, just look. What you're saying is, I'm sort of like the ultimate source of that. Well, not ultimate, but a clear example of that would be, a year is the period that it takes the Earth to form its elliptical traverse around the sun. All right, and then and then I guess also if there was no motion, then time. What you're saying is time is a measure of relative motion.
That's right.
Is
that's right? Yeah.
Okay.
And so the point to make,
but we don't perceive that. As your comment to Hume is, we don't see it. Right? We just as can you form an image of time?
No, that's not exact. But there's more point I want to make. We are aware of that relative change, but what we don't see, and what does not exist, is some absolute time as an entity. There's no metaphysical clock on a metaphysical wall with a time. So
that would be Newton, for example. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So there is no absolute time. It's relative. And so what that means is, what we are concerned about when we're dealing with understanding causal forces and all that is what happens from time t to time t plus 1. But the value we give to t is, does not matter. What matters is the the duration from t to t plus 1. So
Right.
we can take every instance of t to t plus 1 and realize
Right.
that we have no way of giving priority or specialness to any one of those. We know that they come in an order, but
Right.
there's nothing special about this t to t plus 1 compared to this other t to t plus 1.
Right.
And so going from the present t to the t plus 1 tomorrow, like if it's one
Right.
a day, is no different in kind or from the previous t's to t plus 1s. We can treat them all as in the same group. We are this what we can call the principle of indifference, which we come to again apprehend, that we have no way to distinguish those from one another. And so
Right.
when we have any one of them, it's reason that we have no reason to say that the outcome in this particular t to t plus 1 is going to be an outlier compared to the other t's, the t plus 1s.
Right. It's the reliability. Yeah.
So they're all similar. And that, again, it comes from our experience that we notice that there are things that are similar to one another. There are situations that are similar to another and actually indistinguishable from one another. And then again, we can assign a probability so that we can say that if we don't know what happened in this particular t to t plus 1, but we know what happened in a million others, then the position of ordered measurement of this latest t plus 1 can be anywhere in those other millions. It could be
Right.
the highest measurement, it could be in the middle, it can be at the bottom.
Right.
So if we have a million instances of an outcome of an experiment in which the measurements go from A to B, and then we
Right.
come up with a new instance, we can say that there's a million to and over 1,000,001 probability that the new instance's measurement is going to fall somewhere in between A and B.
Right. Okay.
That's so I did kind of talk about the argument. That's one of the arguments in my book. So I'm actually giving an argument again that comes from experience, from observation, and we trust these things only after we've done that thinking based on our experience.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
so
The trust comes afterwards.
That's
whereas,
right.
Whereas
That's right.
both in effect, the pragmatist position that science ultimately rests on faith is sort of an a priori argument, as is the theological argument.
Yeah, and
that is really, so that position is really opposite to what James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson were saying. Yeah. And just one last thing, I tell you, we only have a minute left, a couple of minutes left, but just briefly, do you want to say anything about James Lindsay's discussion about time? Excuse me, about the infinite.
Infinity. Yeah. So
okay, I mean, it's just what if I can just sort of stick my 2 cents in.
Yeah.
I spent many years working with the scientists out at Los Alamos, and they told me that now that the telescopes, the space located telescopes, can now, using a Doppler effect, they believe they can probably see the edge of the universe. In that the galaxies that are moving away from us in terms of a red shift are moving away at approximately the speed of light. Now that to me said, so there would be, evidence to conclude that the entire universe is finite, and that does the infinite exist? It exists. My thinking is it exists only as a concept. It doesn't exist. There's no correlate in effect to the outside. It exists as a potentiality, not something real. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah. You get it. You're on the right track. And here's how I would say it. There's a chapter on philosophy of mathematics in my book, and I do discuss infinity. So let me discuss some of it right here. the concept infinity, it's not saying that these math numbers, or it should not say that these math numbers are unlimited. It's not that there's an unlimited number of numbers and an infinite number of them, or an infinite number of anything in the world. It does not mean unlimited. It means unlimiting. In other words, the concepts in math and number impose no limits onto reality over and above the limits that already exist in reality. Nor does the concept remove any limits that exist in reality. So we have numbers, and we have a number system, and the system is built so that it can accommodate whatever does exist in reality. So in my philosophy of mathematics, there is not an axiom of infinity. There's not an axiom that says there's an infinite number of points, or an infinite number of objects, an infinite number of anything. It's that whatever does exist, we have the conceptual equipment to handle it. And that's the same as with any concepts that humans have, with any conceptual system. For instance, the concept man, as Ayn Rand identified, concepts are open-ended. And in one way in which they're open-ended, they refer to any number of existence. They subsume any number of existence that fit the concept. So the concept man subsumes every man who ever existed, who exists now, and whoever will exist, no matter how many such men there are. And you can say potentially there are infinitely many men that can exist, but at any given time, there's only a finite number of them who have existed. But however many do exist at a time or ever will exist, the concept man can handle it. The concept man is unlimiting, but it does not make a positive statement that there's an infinite number of men. In the same way, a number system or any concept in mathematics, reasonably construed and developed, will not say that there's an infinite number of anything. It will say that our system of math and numbers will accommodate whatever number of things there are. If there's another thing that comes into existence, I'll make a higher number. I have the way to make it higher and higher, again, to the limits of a human mind, let's say. But my conceptual framework of mathematics is not injecting an additional limitation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. All right. Well, Ron, this has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for elucidating your positions on this, and hopefully we'll do this again in the future.
Yeah, and I'll add that a link to my book will be in the program notes for this video when I post the video, so you can find the book that way. And Pete, it's been great talking with you, and I hope we get to do this again sometime.
Sounds like a plan, maybe.
Okay. All right. Bye for now.